Minister, there are many questions, but I don't want the evening to close out without making certain we go back to August 5 of this year and the decision of your government to bring an end to Article 370 and take full responsibility for the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. What I'd like to drive at, or ask you to explain to us, is what is the strategy now of your government to restore a degree of normalcy in the territory, to rebuild confidence, to reestablish civil, political rights? How do you move forward from where you've been to where you'd like to be? How do we get there?
Okay. To answer that question, I'd like to explain to you what was the thought process behind August 5, because that would then answer a lot of what you asked me. Now, the thought process was this. I think many of you who know Indian history will recall that there were about 600 odd princely states at the time of independence who were given a choice of joining India or Pakistan, and most of them made up their minds. One which held out in indecision at that point of time was the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And at that time, Pakistan tried to force the issue by really invading Kashmir. And that decision went the other way, which was Jammu and Kashmir decided to join India instead of Pakistan. Now, the first point which I'd like you to recall is all the states joined the Indian Union in exactly the same terms of conditions. That they actually had a form. I have a picture of the accession, instrument of accession that the Maharaja of Kashmir signed. All of them had a form. The blank parts of the form were the name of the state, the name of the ruler, the date of accession. Otherwise, it was exactly the same. Now, initially when they joined, all of them agreed that they would cede to the Union the rights, the powers on foreign affairs, defense, and communications. And then as the Indian Constitution came into being, the idea was that they would, each one of them, accede to the Constitution in question. And they were participants in the Constitution-making process. So as they acceded, they sent delegates in. So it was like a Philadelphia Convention where, people then sent their delegates as the convention progressed. And Jammu and Kashmir also sent their delegates. Now, the situation in Jammu and Kashmir was peculiar for a number of reasons, and one of them was the fact, of course, that they were a border state, but also that they were themselves under attack at that time. So they had a desire to extend the period of alignment with the rest of India in terms of, the application of laws. The Constituent Assembly recognized that they were a very special case at that point of time. But there was then a big debate. So which parts of the Constitution do you accept, and at what length of time would that take place? So this was not a simple decision. There was a lot of negotiation on it. There's a lot of correspondence on it. And all of this is actually archival material today. Now, to cut a long story short, what happened at that time was that to accommodate them, the only temporary article of the Constitution was drafted. Okay, I underline this, the only temporary article. This was what today we call Article 370. At that point, it was numbered Article 306A. Now, immediately after that article the Constitution was adopted, you had a series of presidential proclamations under that article, which started aligning the state. Okay. In the last 70 years, you had 54 of these presidential proclamations. But here's what went wrong. The presidential proclamations were very rapid in the initial years, but as there was a climate of intimidation and separatism in Kashmir, they started to dry up. They started to dry up because the state politics was now, people found that there was an arbitraging possibility using the separate, the 370 article, because 370 essentially mandated, one of the consequences of 370 was you had local ownership of property. you had, which was a provision of, another provision of the Constitution called 35A. And there were restrictions in many ways of what would be normal economic activity in the state. Over a period of time, you had really three consequences. Number one, you didn't have the economic activity and economic energy in Kashmir, in Jammu and Kashmir, that you had in the rest of India, which meant less jobs, less job opportunities, more sense of alienation, a sense of separatism, and therefore a climate for terrorism from across the border. The second was that the state was, in socio-economic terms, increasingly less aligned with India. So if you look at all the progressive legislation of India, they did not apply to Kashmir, because whenever you drafted a law in India, pretty much, clause 2 or clause 3 of that law would say, but this law is not applicable to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So what you had was, you didn't have right to work, you didn't have right to education, you didn't have right to information, you did not have affirmative action, you did not have the law against domestic violence, you didn't have law on representation of women in local bodies, you didn't have equal property laws between men and women, you didn't have juvenile protection law. So I can cite to you at least about 100 important laws which did not apply to Jammu and Kashmir. Now, one was a political consequence, this economic consequence. The second was a social consequence. But 1 and 2 really led to 3, and that was a political consequence. Because what all of this it did was, it allowed really a sort of a narrow elite to arbitrage this 370, to monopolize political power, to create a sort of a closed loop politics. And they had a vested interest in keeping alive separatist sentiment. And you had actually a situation where separatist political parties were openly allied with terrorist groups operating out of Pakistan. Now, here's the choice which the government faced. When we came back to power this May and did a Kashmir review, there were two choices. One was, you had a set of policies which were on the books for 70 years, but for the last 40 years, they were visibly not working. And by the way, when I say visibly not working, that meant in the last 30 years, 42,000 people got killed. The fact that the level of intimidation had reached a height where you had senior police officers lynched on the streets of Srinagar. You had journalists who wrote against separatism who were assassinated. You had military personnel returning home for Eid who were kidnapped and killed. So, pre-August 5, please remember this, pre-August 5, Kashmir was in a mess. I mean, the difficulties in Kashmir have not started on August 5. August 5 is supposed to be a way of dealing with those difficulties. So the choices were either you continue what was clearly not working, or you tried something very different. And I think the decision was to try something very different. So our expectation today is, by doing away with what was a temporary provision, what was meant as a bridge but became a barrier, that we will be able to push investments, economic activities into Kashmir, that we will be able to, frankly, change the economic landscape, change the social landscape. Now, we realize it's not a easy exercise, because there are deep vested interests which will resist it. So when you do this transition, our first concern was that there would be violence, that there would be demonstrations, terrorists would use those demonstrations. And we had the experience of 2016, when there was a self-advertised terrorist cult figure who was killed, a gentleman called Burhan Wani. And after that, there was a spike in violence, and about 50 plus people lost their lives. So the intention was manage this transition situation without loss of life. What the restrictions which came about gathering of people, about communication, these were intended to prevent that. Now, as the situation stabilizes, I think a lot of those restrictions would be rolled back. Already landlines are reconnected. My understanding is that the mobile towers have started to be switched on. that, the schools are open, the economic activity has picked up. A particular effort is being made to keep the supplies at normal in the state, so there's no shortage of food or medicine or supplies. This is harvest season for apples, so again, a particular effort is being made to procure apples so that the farmers don't feel that they've been victimized by these changes. But having said that, for us, the primary concern would be to prevent loss of life. And if I were to put the temporary suspension of internet on one side of the scale and permanent loss of life on the other,